Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Sheviis, chapter 2, halacha 7. This is the last halacha in chapter 2. Chapter 3 is going to be about fertilizing, but chapter 2 so far has been about the white field, which is a grain field. And we were covering throughout chapter 2 things that dealt with growing things for seed. Now, why is growing things for seed going to be a little bit different than growing things for vegetable matter or growing things for a grain? Well, when you're growing it for seed, it's not being used for human consumption. It's not designed for human consumption. In fact, it's designed for a future crop. And the normal way that farmers work is that they will store seed or buy seed so that they can have a future crop. Not all of the seed is used just for food production. You have to have seed in order to have a future crop. So the Mishnah starts off talking about regarding gourds that one kept alive on the vine because he intends to use them for seed. In other words, he's not going to use these gourds, these pumpkins or what have you, as food. He's going to be using it for seed. And the Mishnah continues, says, if they hardened before Rosh Hashanah of the 7th year, and became unfit for human consumption, it is permissible to keep them in Sheviis. But if they did not harden to this degree before Rosh Hashanah, it is forbidden to keep them in Sheviis. And then it says, in any case, their sprouts are forbidden in Sheviis. What does this mean that their sprouts are forbidden in Sheviis? One explanation could be that it's talking about the buds before they blossom. They're going to be a lot like dates. And a lot of times what they would do, those are edible, and they'll maybe batter them in some eggs. They pick them. Zucchini flowers, that's a great example of them. They're buds, and it's before they develop into zucchinis. And what the Italians will do is they'll batter them in egg, and they'll put them in some bread flour and breadcrumbs, and then they'll fry them up, and they're delicious. And it's a lot like a schnitzel, but it's made out of these flours. They're very flavorful, and they're very delicious. So it was used for consumption, and so this kind of sprout is going to be forbidden in Sheviis. And yeah, it is edible, and it doesn't harden to become a gourd yet, and that's what it's talking about. The Rambam is holding in his commentary in the Mishnah that the prohibition on sefachim applies even to produce whose growth began on the 6th year, and these sprouts would be forbidden for consumption according to the Rambam because it's sefachim. Sefachim is going to be the Rabbanan, and other people are going to be explaining like the Yom Tov is going to be saying that these sprouts, in fact, hardened with the gourds before Sheviis, and they were not actually edible. However, because they appear similar to edible produce, it is decreed that they are treated in the same manner. That's another interpretation. So let's walk through this part. Now, pumpkins and gourds, they're normally going to be considered the product like a vegetable in which they're going to be picked. So you would have the normal law for a vegetable. And if you're going to be picking them, you're going to be growing them in the 6th year, and they're going to sprout and get going in the 6th year, but you're not going to pick it until the 7th year. Then it's going to be treated as 7th year produce. So even if you have the gourd totally completed in the 6th year, and then you pick it in the 7th year, it's going to be considered to be Sheviis produce. This case is a little bit different, though. this case is where, and that's why it's in a Mishnah, that the grower knows that he does not want them for vegetable. He knows he wants them for seed. And all through the chapter 2, you could say, well, wait a second. Is this really a hekesh for other things? Where it's talking about the cowpea, the cow bean? Is this going to really be where if you're growing something for seed, that it could actually change the status of when things would be picked? And the answer is, yeah, this is. This is not only for the cow bean, which is like the fava bean, but it's going to be for other things as well. And you can see here for the vine on the gourds that this is going to not be picked when they're ready, because the intent is to have them for seeds for planting. So it doesn't make any difference if they shrivel up on the vine, because he just wants the seeds. And the seeds are what matters to him, not the actual flesh of the pumpkin or the gourd. So if the grower is leaving the gourds unpicked, then it's like the gourd itself, the vegetable itself, is not relevant. What's relevant is the seed. He's not using it for food, not using the seed for food either. And the Mishnah is simply describing a common example where somebody would leave the gourd attached to the vine even after it's ready to be picked, says the Chazan Ish in 9.4. Now, Rav is saying that by leaving it on the vine too long, the gourds will dry out and harden. So by the time Sheviis arrives, they are no longer edible. And the idea is that since these hardened gourds and pumpkins are not fit for humans to eat, they could still be used for animal food. Goats will basically eat anything. And it is possible for them to be subject to Sheviis laws, because Sheviis laws does apply to animal food. Now, in the case of drying out everything, okay, when you dry it out during the 6th year, and it goes to the point where you can't even use it for human consumption anymore, these gourds are going to be treated as though they were actually picked at the same time. Why? Because the attachment to the vine doesn't even improve them anymore. And the idea is they're not actually picked before Sheviis. And so the idea is that even if they're not picked during Sheviis, they're still going to be classified as 6th year produce. And by the way, that law would still be the same regarding how we were treating beans. In other words, if you were treating the beans as the cowpeas, cow beans, as growing in the 6th year, and you're not growing it for vegetable, you're growing it for the seed, and you don't change your mind, the intent stays with the seed, but you pick them in the 7th year. It's not for something that's for edible for consumption. You're not picking it as a vegetable. So it stays as 6th year produce, because again, the criteria is when it takes root. It's when it takes root. That's when you're doing it. Why? Because again, this is for seed. You're not eating it. It's not edible, not designed to be edible. Again, you have two categories within the food. You have one where it's going to be used for seed, and you have one where it's going to be used for consumption. Now, the part where it's going to be used for consumption, that's going to be relevant for the vegetable from when you're picking it, because again, it's going to be mostly sustained by the water in the year in which it's picked. There's a lot of vegetables like, coriander and parsley, and if you don't water those for a few days, they'll wilt and die. You have to maintain water constantly. So the question is, what about the sefachin ban? And, that does not apply to crops that began growing in the 6th year, but the Mishnah is not talking about over here gourds that must be uprooted as sefachim. What it's talking about is talking about gourds that remain attached, and they're going to get the sanctity of Sheviis. And the idea is that you're you might be in a case where you changed your mind, and you intended to grow them for vegetable, and then you changed your mind and decided in the seventh year that you're going to change your mind and grow them as seeds. And the seeds of Sheviis, that can't be used for planting. And why would that be? Because the Torah itself specifies it. It's in Leviticus 25:6 that the produce of the Sheviis year should be for eating, and that means that you should be eating it and not for planting it. So that same verse is going to apply to forbidding forbid somebody to stockpile Sheviis produce for any reason. Certainly, even if you were changing your mind and deciding then to turn it from a vegetable into seed, and then you would have a problem, because one problem is that you're going to have people that are going to look at people growing this, and they're going to play games. They're going to grow it like a vegetable, and then they're going to change their mind like seeds, and then you're going to end up where people might keep them attached to the ground, and you can have an issue, because it can look like they're stockpiling Sheviis produce, and that's going to be an issue. So when everything is going to get picked is going to matter, and certainly, as it was expressing for this gourd, that if it's hardening before Rosh Hashanah and it's visible in a field that everybody can walk by and see these gourds are clearly on the vine, but they should have been picked before, and they've kept them on the vine, and they're using them to dry out. They're long past human consumption. Then you don't have a Marasign problem, because then it's clear that this is being used for seed. That's a key part of it. So if you're not leaving this to dry out, and you're in the seventh year and you were growing it for vegetable, and then you changed your mind and it didn't dry out, and then you say, "Oh, I'm growing it for seed," then you have a big Marasign problem, because it looks like people are going to be using this for human consumption and trying to get out of because it has Sheviis sanctity, and then you're gonna compare that to where you have the gourds that people purposefully left to dry out, so that it's obvious it's past its goodness and it's past its date. It's clear that this is not used for people to eat it, but rather for this other use, which is going to be seed. Now, the Mishnah is going to turn to a new conversation about watering a field during Sheviis, because again, chapter 2 is about fields of grain, fields of vegetables. And the Mishnah says, one may water white soil during Sheviis. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon. Water white soil, what does that mean? So this is really also meaning a white field. That's going to be the term that's used to describe a field of grain or vegetables. And this is not like in chapter 1, Halacha 1, which is talking about fields of trees, orchards of trees. And this is talking about generally fields that the crops can survive on rainwater, even without additional irrigation, says the Chazan Ish. And the idea Rabbi Shimon is holding, that the rabbis allowed watering during Sheviis, even in fields in which watering is not critical but merely beneficial. And this is basically used as sprinkling. It's not a full watering, but it's a light watering, and it would be administered from rainwater, and they might use it from pits that they dig in the field to capture the rainwater. And the allowance to water during Sheviis is related to vegetables that will be picked after Sheviis. That's going to be the idea. So similarly, it's permissible in the start of Sheviis, before Sheviis, to water vegetables that will be picked during Sheviis. But watering during Sheviis for the sake of vegetables that grew and will be picked during Sheviis, that's not allowed. So let me repeat that again. This is coming from Rashi in Moed Katan. When you have watering that's going to come in Sheviis for vegetables that are growing and being planted and being picked during Sheviis, that's not allowed. This is talking about a different case where you're watering vegetables with a very light sprinkling of water that's going to be picked either after Sheviis, or it was planted and took root and everything before Sheviis and it's going to be planted and picked. Sorry, it's going to be picked, not planted. It's going to be picked during Sheviis. So the idea, says the Rosh, is that the reason it is forbidden during Sheviis to water vegetables that will grow and also be picked during Sheviis is because this produce is prohibited for human consumption and animal consumption under the rabbinic ban of sefachim. And this is going to be a little bit different than vegetables that grew before Sheviis and that are going to be picked after Sheviis. That, by the way, is not going to be subject to the sefachim prohibition. That's what the Chazan Ish says. So the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say that Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov forbids this. So he's saying Rabbi Yaakov bar Eliezer bar Yaakov is disputing Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai's permit to water any type of field during Sheviis. He's going to be holding that watering is going to be permitted only for fields that are dependent on irrigation and not for rain-watered fields. Keep in mind that some of the rain-watered fields, when it's at a lower elevation, like in a valley, might not need any irrigation at all. So that could be another thing that comes into mind. And then it's going to totally change topics again. And it's going to say one may stir the rice paddy during Sheviis. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon, but Rabbi Shimon agrees that one may not trim the rice plants. So the Mishnah is talking about here, says the Chazan Ish in 16:4, that watering is going to be allowed in both irrigated and rain-watered fields. That's what Rabbi Shimon is saying. And the Chazan Ish is explaining what this is saying, that Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai is adding that in rice paddies, you're even allowed to stir the mud. That's going to be the idea. So the idea here, even according to what Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov would be saying, is that he would be agreeing that watering would be permitted in the case of a rice paddy, because there's a lot of water that the rice crop would need. That's the insight by the Chazan Ish. So then the Mishnah continues and it says, but Rabbi Shimon agrees that one may not trim the rice plants. So the Rosh is saying about this that one may not clip their leaves, and although Rabbi Shimon himself in the Mishnah above is allowing the removal of leaves for grape clusters, he's not allowing the trimming of leaves of rice plants. And that is because Rabbi Shimon understands that the removal of the leaves is an activity that's preventing the cluster from being damaged, but trimming the rice plant is actually going to stimulate it to grow. That's going to be the idea. And again, we talked about this in chapter 2. Any activity, when you look at it, if it has a dual purpose, if one purpose is one activity but has two purposes, one activity, one part of that is where it saves the plant. Well, if you had an activity that was just to save the plant, that would be fine. But again, we're talking about this activity that has two purposes. One part would be to save the plant, and the other part is that it promotes the growth, stimulates the growth. And that is going to make this forbidden. That's going to make this practice forbidden. And actually, any practice. In Sheviis, you can stand back and you can say, at any agricultural activity, is this going to be promoting growth of the seventh year crop? And if there's any aspect of that work that actually does promote the growth, you're not allowed to do it. Very simple. So to here, you're not trimming by trimming the rice plants, you'd be helping to clear out growth, and the removal of leaves would prevent the rice from being damaged. That's true, but it would also promote the growth, and that's the problem. So the Gemara is going to move on, and in the Mishnah we were talking about gourds that are going to be hardening before Rosh Hashanah, and the idea is that they have to be in a state where it's unfit for consumption, and when it's unfit for consumption, it can be kept during Sheviis. Now, this is going to again split up to two categories. Hey, what happens if you're growing these pumpkins and these totally look like they could be used and eaten, and you say, oh no, I changed my mind, I want to use them as seed? You have a problem, because it's visible that it could be used for food, and you have a problem because it can look like you have more sign problems, because everybody else is going to see that you're keeping nice pumpkins there, and it's going to have Sheviis sanctity. So what does that mean? Well, let's say you have a whole crop of pumpkins. I mean, a huge field. Well, you're not allowed to sell it. You're not allowed to sell those pumpkins. Now, likewise, if you let those pumpkins dry out so they were withered, because you don't care about the flesh at all, you only care about the seed. The seed is what matters to you. And people walk by, they see these withered pumpkins on the vine. It means that during the 7th year, these are just withered pumpkins. You're obviously not using it for flesh. Well, this is going to have the halachic status of being 6-year crop, because again, if you were to pick it as a vegetable, this would be 7th year crop, and that would be putting it as Sheviis sanctity. You can't sell this produce. But if this is 6th year's crop, and you're only growing it for the seed, and you've visibly allowed everything to wither, and you collect all of these withered pumpkins, and you take out all the seeds, you are allowed to sell the seeds, even on Sheviis. And in fact, a lot of farmers make a lot of money and really will grow fields just to sell seed to other farmers. So this does have an economic impact, and it does have a foot in economic reality. So you could have an entire field here that you can sell the seed on the 7th year, because it's 6th year produce. Now, again, if you just had the pumpkins and you let them be very nice and full and fleshy, and then you were to go and sell this field of pumpkins, well, then you'd be selling Sheviis produce, and you have a special curse in the Torah for somebody who sells Sheviis produce. You're not allowed to do it. It guarantees a lot of poverty for the person and a lot of problems with Shemayim, and they also can't serve as a witness. So this will even apply if somebody comes and has these nice fleshy pumpkins and they've changed their mind and they're really going to try to sell the seed. You'd say, no. That is really vegetable. That's really 7th year produce. Again, this Mishnah is talking about where these gourds are hardened before Rosh Hashanah, and the gourd itself becomes unfit for consumption. That you're allowed to keep during Sheviis, and that is going to be 6th year produce. Two different categories. Very important to keep it straight. So the Gemara says, why do I need the gourds to have remained on the vine until the point where they have hardened? And the question is, where it's saying, one should be permitted to keep them in Sheviis even if they did not harden, as long as they became unfit for human consumption before Rosh Hashanah. So what this is trying to suggest is that gourds would always harden before they became unfit for consumption. And it could mean that, why wasn't it kept in this condition of becoming unfit for consumption without mentioning that it became hardened? Why does it actually come and say hardened? Why not just say unfit for consumption? Why? What's going on where it becomes so withered it becomes hardened? That's the criteria. Why is that there? That's what the Gemara is asking. The Gemara is going to answer that the two conditions of hardening and becoming unfit for consumption are actually one and the same. So the idea here is that when the Mishnah is saying hardening and unfit for consumption, that these are two criteria. And the Gemara answers this question and says, as long as they harden, they become like all other garden seeds that are not fit for human consumption and are therefore judged as produce of the 6th year. So the Mishnah is trying to give the reasoning behind this ruling on why it's allowed to keep in Sheviis these gourds that have become hardened before Rosh Hashanah. And the idea is because they are unfit for human consumption. So if you had a case where the guy was growing his pumpkins and the year changed and he decides, nope, I want to keep it as seeds, but these are nice, beautiful pumpkins that will be delicious. They haven't hardened, they haven't withered. They are definitely fit for consumption. And he says, no, I want to sell it for seeds. And he's trying to play some games. And basically, this is an issue because they did not harden before Rosh Hashanah for him. And he wants to try to salvage it. Okay, he knows that he can't sell this crop. He knows he can't sell this. He has to just leave it to the animals or for poor people to gather. It's a total loss for him. And so the guy decides he's going to play a game. He's going to say, no, it's just for seed, and then I can sell the seed on the market, at least recover some of my economic loss here. Well, you're not allowed to because these pumpkins are fit for human consumption. That's the trick, okay? If you have these pumpkins that are fit for human consumption in the 7th year, it's treated like vegetable. You can't sell the produce. You can't sell the seed because it wasn't grown for seed. So you can't come along later and say, I changed my mind. I'm using it for seed now, and at least I'll get something out of this. No, not allowed to. This is now going to be 7th year produce, and you're not allowed to sell the whole field. You're not allowed to sell the produce in the field. That could be a very large field. It could be worth a lot of money. So the Gemara is going to talk about the method for determining whether a gourd is going to be dry enough before Rosh Hashanah. And the Gemara says, how does one examine the gourd for hardness? Rabbi Yosei ben Hanina says he pierces it with a sharp object. And if the hole fixes itself, in other words, it closes up after the object has been removed, the gourd is forbidden to be kept in Sheviis, and if it is not, it is permitted. In other words, this is so hard that you take a sharp stick, perhaps like a metal tool, and you stick a hole in this gourd. And if this gourd, cracks and makes a hole, and the hole doesn't fix itself, it stays as a hole, well, that's hard enough. And if the pumpkin comes and seals the hole up by itself and it fixes it, then it's saying it's not hard enough. And I'll tell you something, in Africa, they'll grow gourds that they will dry out, and then they will actually empty them out and cut them and use them as containers. That's how hard they get. And that's what it's trying to describe. It is clear when you walk by one of these fields that when you look at these pumpkins that are purposefully dried out, these gourds that are purposefully dried out, that it will be obvious to everyone that this is used as seed and this is not used as produce. And that's going to be the idea. Now, this has to be this level of dried out before Rosh Hashanah. Otherwise, it is not going to be fit for, you're not allowed to keep it in Sheviis. That's going to be the idea. Why? Because it's going to have some degree of moisture. That's going to be the idea. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about the status of the gourd's foliage. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yonah Bastraya says that gourd leaves are exempt from the Meiser obligation because they are unfit for human consumption. And this was said only as long as the plants have not yet produced gourds. But if they have produced gourds, the leaves too are treated like vegetables. From when the gourd plant reaches this stage, its leaf becomes edible. So that's going to be one of the ideas about this. Now, there are other leaves that are edible. One of the leaves that are edible as well are grapevine leaves. You have the leaves from grapevines. When they reach a certain stage, they're edible as well. And I know that in Greece they use them to wrap rice up. They will soak them in salt and vinegar, and it will preserve the leaf. And then they take the leaf and they use it to wrap up steamed rice. It's pretty good. Anyway, so apparently after the vines will produce gourds, the status of these leaves will change and it will be like a vegetable. It's treated like a vegetable, and that means that it does have a tithing obligation because it is fit for human consumption. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about another plant that is unfit for human consumption. And Rabbi Yosef rules with regards to the leaf of the cool cassia plant that it is forbidden during Sheviis to use them as receptacles for swallowing water because the deers want to consume them. So the idea is that the cool cassia leaf is going to be eaten by a deer, and that's going to make it subject to the Sheviis restriction, because it says in the Torah that you have to leave the Sheviis produce out for the animals, and so that this produce becomes fit for just this animal that does go into the field and look for this leaf, and that's going to cause it to acquire Sheviis sanctity. So another case here, says the Vilna Goan, about this is that one may not fashion them into drinking receptacles during Sheviis, as this would cause a destruction in the Sheviis produce and make it so that the deer wouldn't eat them. And normally the deer will eat this leaf, but if you fashion it to make it into a receptacle, it will the deers will not eat it, and it's the deer's natural food in the wilderness apparently, and that will make it so that it is having Sheviis sanctity. Because again, it's not just people; it's also the animals. That's another thing you have to keep in mind. The Torah writes it for the animals as well. So the Mishnah was talking about one who may water white soil. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov is going to forbid this. Now, this is where you're taking a small amount of water and sprinkling it through the field. It's not a full watering of the field. That full watering of the field is going to be not allowed. Now, the Gemara is going to talk about this dispute between these two different Tanaim, and the Gemara says that the opinion of Rabbi Shimon accords with that of the rabbis, and the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov accords with his own view stated elsewhere. For we learned in the Mishnah there, this is going to be in Moed Katan 1.3, where he's also bringing up this view as well, that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, over there in Moed Katan 1.3, is saying that one may draw water from one tree to another tree on Kol Moed, where one may water trees by diverting the water through small channels from one to another. And it's very common in very advanced, pre-mechanical, pre-industrial farm systems where you would create these smaller channels where you could channel water down throughout the field. And basically what this is talking about was where you're damming up one of the channels to divert the water into another tree. So the idea here is that in Kol Moed, you can draw water from one tree to another, and doing it through these small channels and damming it up. And the Gemara says, provided that he does not water the entire field. The idea is that the rabbis are going to permit watering, that they're going to permit watering the entire field as stated at the end of that Mishnah, and the rabbis considered even watering between the trees to be necessary for the prevention of loss. That's going to be the idea. So it would come up that Rabbi Shimon is going to permit the watering of a field during Sheviis, and it would follow the view of the rabbis who permit it during Chol Hamoed, because in Chol Hamoed you're trying to avert a total loss of the trees. And Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov would prohibit watering a field during Sheviis, and that would follow his own opinion that the same is also going to be prohibited during Chol Hamoed. So, one of the things, because Chol Hamoed is not that long, perhaps you're trying to do some water to the plants because you want to make sure that the fruit is okay. You want to make sure that the produce is going to be okay. So the Gemara is going to limit the ruling to a specific case, and Rabbi Mana said the following comment without any attribution, that Rabbi Avin said in the name of Shmuel, that they, the sages, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov disagree regarding a standard field. A standard field is going to be where the trees are planted at the standard concentration of 10 trees per betsei of land. And that betsei is going to have a lot of link and connection to the size of the courtyard for the temple and the sizing of it. But anyway, and the Mishkan. So the Gemara is going to continue with this point, and it's going to say, with what are we dealing with in the Mishnah? And if we are dealing with trees that are spread apart so that they are less than 10 to a betsei, then in that case, all would agree that it is forbidden to water the area between the trees during Chol Hamoed. And if we are dealing with trees that are close together so that they are more than 10 to a betsei, and in that case, all would agree it is permissible to water an area between the trees during Chol Hamoed. So the idea is that, says Rosh Cirilio, in a case where the trees are grouped in such a close proximity, where it's more than 10 per betsei, then even Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov agrees to allow watering of the entire field because it's going to be needed to prevent the trees from drying out. When you're growing it in that kind of density, you might be using it to grow for firewood. You're not going to be using it for a normal kind of field where you're going to be producing a normal kind of orchard yield. So in this kind of case, even he would allow it during Chol Hamoed because you're talking about growing it for firewood. Is not going to be used for human consumption, and you don't want it to dry out. You want it to keep growing. So with what are we dealing with, says the Gemara, with trees that are planted so that the trees are exactly 10 to a betsei. And when they are going to be corresponding to this normal size orchard that we were covering in chapter 1, Rabbi Eliezer says this, Gemara, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov considers them equivalent to trees that are spread apart for which water is forbidden. And while the rabbis consider them equivalent to trees that are close together for which watering is permitted. So we remember in chapter 1 that if you're planting along a betsei, the standard size field is going to be a betsei for measurement. And if you're planting a row of 5 and then a row of 5 so that you have 10 trees in total, it's going to be 5 by 5, okay? So 10 in total. It's one row on top of another row. Then what happens is the roots are going to fully spread out and fully get all of the nutrition and moisture from all of the soil of the betsei. It fully utilizes this betsei for nourishment and moisture. And it's right at that line, so that the rabbis now are basically considering it to be trees that are close together. And because the trees are close together, it's going to be permitted. Again, it's exactly at that line of, full saturation. These roots are fully taking up all of the land for water and nutrition. And so the idea of the rabbis, right at this line of 10 per betseah, is it's counting it as close together, and because of that, watering is going to be permitted. So when the trees are going to be spread out so that they're going to be less than 10 per betseah, like 3 per betseah, everyone agrees that watering that area between them is not going to be allowed during Kol HaMoed. So everybody agrees on that. Now, the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to ask a question, and it's going to say, now even the rabbis say in the case of trees that are spread apart further than 10 per betseah, that is forbidden to water the area between them during Kol HaMoed. What is the law with regards to drawing water from tree to tree? So the idea is going to be that you have these little channels, and are you going to be able to dam up these little channels to divert water? Let's say you have the other kind of full utilization of a betseah, where you have a betseah, you have 3 of these large trees on it, equally spaced, and we covered that in chapter 1, and what that is doing is it's doing full utilization of each tree, so that some of the land is not utilized for nutrition, some of the land is not utilized for water, but the growth of the radius of the roots becomes its maximum size, and each tree gets maximum nourishment. And in the case of 10 per betseah, the entire betseah has full utilization, but part of the tree has overlap with the other parts of the tree. So that doesn't happen where it's going to be, say, 3 to a betseah. So they're asking, can you divert this water where you have, like say 3 trees to a betseah? And they're asking, what is the law regarding this situation on watering a tree from tree to tree during Kol HaMoed? And the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, let us derive this aspect of the rabbi's position from the position of Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov. And the Gemara says, just as Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov said with regards to trees that in his opinion are spread apart, that those are basically planted as 10 to a betseah, that it is forbidden to water the entire field, but it is permitted to draw water from tree to tree. So with this damming thing, you can do the damming thing from tree to tree, he's saying. And the Gemara says, so do the rabbis say in the case of trees that are planted further apart than 10 to a betseah, that it's permitted to draw water from tree to tree, even though it is forbidden to water the entire field? And the Gemara is now going to come to talk about this earlier case about the dispute between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov in this Mishnah related to Sheviis, to come and to clean up all of this regarding Kol HaMoed and also Sheviis. So the Gemara is going to come to try to counter this association. And the Gemara says, have we not assumed that with regards to trees that are spread apart, everyone agrees that watering the area between them is forbidden during Kol HaMoed? Indeed, it's so. But consider this then, that this white soil about which our Mishnah is speaking, is it not comparable to trees that are spread apart? Basically, it's saying, yes, it is. And Mara Fulda says about this that this Mishnah is dealing with a field of grain or vegetables that has no trees. And if anything, this type of field is going to be similar to an orchard where the trees are actually spread apart. And even in that case, the rabbis are going to forbid watering on Kol HaMoed. So the idea is that if you had 10 trees that are very close together and it's maximizing the full utilization for water, and it's planted at this size of the orchard, a standard size orchard on a standard size of betseah of 10 trees per betseah, then they're saying that the trees are going to need water. So that you can water in a Kol HaMoed. That's what the rabbis are saying. But if it's less than 10, then they're saying that you can't water it. And they're saying that with regards to a field, it should be like a orchard that has, say, 3 trees to a betseya, that this white field should be treated like that. And so the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say that Rabbi Shimon is ruling that this field may be watered even during Sheviis. Now, this is not, again, a full watering. This is going to be a sprinkling. And the Gemara is going to say, rather, it is evident that Rabbi Shimon's leniency in this Mishnah is related here only regarding Sheviis, but there, regarding Kol Hamoed, he agrees that a field whose trees are spread apart may not be watered. So then it would show that there's no connection between the view of Rabbi Shimon and that of the rabbis. In other words, they're saying that the case of Sheviis and the case of Kol Hamoed, if you were to read this, that it's really not linked. You can't use Kol Hamoed and watering of trees in Kol Hamoed to do this for understanding the halachas for Sheviis. That's what this is saying if you're going to go by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's leniency. And in this case, the rabbis are also going with Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's leniency in this case. So the dispute between this Gemara is going to be, are these laws for the watering going to be like Kol Hamoed, and then it's going to be like Kol Hamoed for Sheviis? Or the laws of Sheviis are going to stand on its own, and though you have to take the laws for watering a tree on Kol Hamoed as its own thing, and that the laws of Sheviis are its own thing? Which is it going to be? So now the Gemara is going to give another sugya, and it's going to try to show why the laws of Kol Hamoed are actually going to be more strict than the laws of Sheviis. So the Gemara says, and what is the difference between Sheviis and Kol Hamoed? With regards to Sheviis, since work is permissible in it, in other words, in Sheviis, there's no prohibition against work per se. And the Torah is merely prohibiting, says Rabbi Kanievsky in his Beur shiurim, the agricultural activities that conflict with the resting of the land. So the work that you have during Kol Hamoed is not exactly the same kind of work during Sheviis. So the Gemara says, since work is permitted in it, the sages allowed one to perform an activity such as watering, regardless of whether it involves excessive exertion or does not involve excessive exertion. So in Kol Hamoed, the Torah says you may not exert yourself. But in Sheviis, there's no such mandate that you may not exert yourself. So let's say you have to sprinkle your field with some water. And let's say it was a light sprinkling, but let's say you're a little bit older and you did exert yourself. Well, you didn't do anything wrong in Sheviis. You followed the law and you did your light sprinkling. You're allowed to do your light sprinkling. And you exerted yourself. There's no prohibition against exerting yourself on Sheviis. But on Kol Hamoed, the Torah says you're not allowed to exert yourself. So there is that strictness in Kol Hamoed that doesn't apply to Sheviis. The Gemara continues and says, with regards to Kol Hamoed, since work is forbidden in it, the sages did not permit any activity except that which is meant to prevent an irretrievable loss. And even then, they permitted only that which does not involve excessive exertion. And since watering between the trees that are spread apart involves excessive exertion, it is prohibited during Kol Hamoed despite the necessity. So you can see here that the opinions of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and the opinions here of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov with regards to whether you can apply this other Mishnah in Moed Katan regarded to watering trees on Kol Hamoed, whether it's going to be the same for Sheviis over here. And they're showing here that no, there's actually a distinction. That Kol Hamoed, the Torah says you may not exert yourself, and says you may not do any work at all except if it's going to prevent a loss. And over here, you're going to have work that is actually going to be permitted. One of the things that you're going to be allowed to do is you could put on that rancid matter onto trees. And in Kol HaMoed, if you had to put rancid matter onto trees, that might be forbidden if you exerted yourself. But over here, you are allowed to exert yourself. So there's another distinction between Kol HaMoed and Sheviis. And the Gemara says that there are others who wish to learn the difference between the two laws from the following reasoning. With regards to Sheviis, since its interval is going to be prolonged, they permitted watering even between trees that are spread apart. But regarding Kol HaMoed, where the interval is very short, they ruled that watering is going to be forbidden except where absolutely necessary, where the direct benefit beneath the trees or even between the trees, where there would be 10 or more per betseah, because the trees can survive without water until the festival is over. Now the Gemara is going to challenge this, and this will be the end of chapter 2. Gemara says, the last sugya says, but consider these final 7 days before the conclusion of the Sheviis year. And they're saying, is it not reasonable to regard them as equivalent to the 7 days of a festival? And as a result, in these 7 days of the year, it will be forbidden to water the field whose trees are spread apart. And they're saying it cannot be. So the Brisa is saying that they found a Brisa that has taught that one may water white soil during Sheviis, but not during Kol HaMoed. These are the words of Rabbi Shimon, but Rabbi Eliezer Bar Yaakov, however, forbids watering even during Sheviis. So the wording of this Brisa is showing that Rabbi Shimon is going to allow watering during Sheviis, and that's going to be under the same circumstances that exist during Kol HaMoed. That is going to be that, when the prohibition will persist for only 7 days or less. And then the difference between Sheviis and Kol HaMoed is going to be that in Kol HaMoed it is forbidden to water between trees that are spread apart because of the excessive exertion that it involves. So one of the differences between here is going to be that the nature of work that can happen during Sheviis and Kol HaMoed is going to be that, in Sheviis there's no prohibition to exert yourself, but in Kol HaMoed there is. And the other distinction between it is going to be that Sheviis is going to be prolonged. It's going to be a whole year. And in terms of Kol HaMoed, it can just be a week. It's going to be short. So that's going to be two differences. And it's going to show that in many ways, Kol HaMoed is actually going to be more strict than Sheviis. And that's why Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai and the sages rule the way they do, and why you have to create a thing in your mind where you decouple, you take apart this link between watering plants, and saving trees and plants for work during Kol HaMoed, and trying to apply it over with Sheviis. And what they're trying to show is that the work that is forbidden in Kol HaMoed, even the Torah itself says, is not like the work that is going to be forbidden or allowed during Sheviis. And so you have to make a separation in your mind. The Gemara is saying, don't consider it the same. It's not. Have a great day.